Hello, everyone. I'm Bloomberg opinion editor Sarah Green Carmichael. I'm here today with Amanda Little, a professor of journalism and science writing at Vanderbilt University. She is the author of a Bloomberg opinion series on the fate of food after COVID-19, as well as the book The Fate of Food: What We'll Eat in a Bigger, Hotter, Smarter World. Amanda, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Sarah, it's great to be here. Thanks.
So I want to start with the meat industry because we've just had some news in that area. It has become more vulnerable to cyber attacks as well as to climate change. And I'm wondering, what would it take to make the meat industry more resilient?
Well, in a nutshell, we need to turn back the tides of consolidation. Agriculture has experienced radical consolidation in the last half century. I think there are about four processing companies in the US that slaughter 80% of the beef, four meatpacking companies process roughly 2/3 of the nation's hogs, five companies control about 60% of the broiler chicken market. And we know that there are amazing cost savings benefits to consolidation. But those benefits are really increasingly outweighed by the risks of disruption. And, the pandemic was a big wake-up call when major hog and chicken processing plants became COVID hotspots. We saw those cascading shutdowns. And, in one day, Smithfield Foods plant, shut down, and more than 15% of all pork in the US was offline, right? And last week, the JBS attacks, or I guess that was 2 weeks ago, sabotaged a fifth of all US beef processing in a matter of minutes. And we heard Secretary Vilsack say in a press call, efficiency comes at a price, right? That price is the lack of resilience when you have major disruptions. And we are in an era of increasing disruptions, and climate change, very notably, is increasing the risk of disruption. So what we need and what resilience looks like is fewer mega producers and more smaller and mid-sized local and regional protein production. So more Davids and fewer Goliaths. And the reality is that the Davids will be much more nimble and resilient than the Goliaths.
Well, I guess a background question here that I maybe should have asked you even first is some environmentalists would say that we shouldn't even be eating meat, that there's just no way to do it sustainably. That's something Jane Goodall said when I interviewed her a few weeks ago. Just give up eating meat. Should we stop eating animals?
Well, I have really struggled with this. I grew up in a household where we ate so much red meat that chicken and vegetables were, chicken and fish were sort of considered vegetable matter. Like, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, home of some of the greatest barbecue in the country. And I've really tried to be vegetarian and vegan and pescatarian and all the versions of this. I think the longest I went was like 63 days as a vegan, and I ended up back at the barbecue. I'm aware of the significant impacts of industrial meat production. I'm also aware that the shifting diets globally are really important to look at. In the last 50 years, we've seen a doubling of global population and a tripling of meat consumption. So we're, shifting toward more meat and protein heavy diets. But I, am the first to admit that I am a failed vegan and a lapsed vegetarian, and I don't do well being told, not to eat meat. I'm increasingly, adapting to some meat alternatives, and the Beyond Meat and Impossible Meat products are getting better and better. And so are, any number of the disruptive cellular agriculture, products that are not yet on the market, but they're going to be. I am personally trying to kind of displace meat, the centrality of meat on my plate, right? Thinking of meat as a condiment rather than the main attraction in my meal. It kind of depends who you are. If you're someone who needs, a kind of absolutist approach and you just need to go completely off of it, then there are great environmental benefits to doing that. But there are also real environmental impacts to having, for example, imported raspberries and asparagus in the middle, off season that are air freighted. There are all kinds of unsustainable aspects of our food supply, and meat is one of them.
Yeah. Well, and in a way, it feels odd to ask you about giving up any food group at a time when so many people around the world are hungry. And the COVID pandemic has only made that problem worse. One of your columns, I read that food insecurity has doubled in the US, and it has in fact tripled in households with children. What do we need to do to fix this rising problem of world hunger?
I mean, oh my gosh, what a huge question. We need to significantly improve food relief programs in regions of the world that are already facing significant food insecurity. I mean, I think in more than half a dozen places in the world, especially in the Middle East and Southeastern Africa, there are populations facing full-blown famine. And we need emergency food relief programs. The World Food Program with the UN is doing great work and needs more support. In the US, we need significant improvements in food relief, food pantries, food banks, and notably, though, we also have to stop food waste or significantly rein it in. I mean, we have a massive epidemic of food waste, especially in the US. And we need at the same time to build sustainable practices into agriculture. We need to transform soil into a massive carbon sink and improve soil fertility to make it sustainable over time. And I think we need to stop clamoring for significant population growth until we have really gotten a handle on food security going forward.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about, the baby bust during COVID. And you had a column pointing out that actually, maybe more mouths to feed is not what we need right now. And I'm especially mindful of this while we have also a mega drought going on in the American West and some other headwinds. Is there any risk that climate change might get to a point where we actually struggle to feed the number of people we have, not because we're not distributing the food or because we're wasting too much food, but because we can't grow the food?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a serious risk. And the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, has made it very clear that by mid-century, the world may reach a threshold of global warming beyond which current agricultural practices can no longer support large human civilizations. That is a direct quote from, I believe it was a 2014 IPCC report that I've committed to memory. And, the evidence has become only more abundant since then that, climate change is bearing down on food producers globally. We've seen in the US everything from, avocado producers and specialty, wines to, row crops, to cash crops, rice, soy, wheat, etc., getting hammered by drought, heat, storms, invasive insects, bacterial blights, etc. And there's no question that there are significant challenges going forward. But that assumes that we continue with current agricultural practices, and I'm very hopeful that we will adapt, and we already are adapting and finding smarter, better, more efficient, more nimble ways to produce food. And I've traveled all over the world meeting farmers and engineers and scientists who are working on exactly that.
Yeah, what are some of the exciting innovations happening in this space?
It's so much fun for me to talk about this because, I shy away from techno optimism. I think we all have a responsibility to be very careful about, just technology will save the world. But food is a really interesting area where we see technology informed by the wisdom of natural systems. There are incredible advances in technology that can help build resilience. And for my book, The Fate of Food, I met scientists using modern breeding tools like CRISPR to create nutritious heirloom crops that can resist and withstand drought and heat. Scientists using AI and robotics to eliminate the use of agrochemicals and make aquaculture sustainable. Scientists growing animal meat without animals and plants without soil and sun, with vertical farming and indoor cropping. These decentralized hyper-local farms that will build resilience and also be able to withstand disruptions like we've talked about. Great advances in finding ways to eliminate food waste. People also who are scaling up conservation agriculture and reviving ancient plants, recycling sewage and gray water to create drought-proof water supplies. It's really an exciting moment in climate smart food production.
Yeah, irrigation is such a big part of agriculture, and especially since in the US, so many of our crops are grown in the West. I'm curious to know what you see as solutions to the drought situation out there.
Yeah, the drought-proof water supply is a big one, especially if you live in California. You're aware that, diminishing water supplies in Northern California, which have been coming down to supply Southern California for a long time. Southern California has been drawing on the Colorado River, which also supplies water to, 7 other states or something, and is increasingly beleaguered. It's a really scary time, and California is the bread basket and the dairy case and the meat case of our country in a lot of ways. And we there too have some really exciting opportunities for tech innovation. Just like we're coming up with alternative meat supplies, there's sort of alternative water tech coming into play.
Drink our own pee. Do we have to drink our own pee?
Yeah, poop water. It's called toilet to tap water. Recycled wastewater is the way that the industry. But you know what? I've had it. I've drunk the stuff that was 6 hours earlier, flushed in a toilet, and it's every bit as good as what you can get from a bottle or the Fiji, the water from the Swiss Alps. I mean, it's pushed through an RO membrane, a reverse osmosis membrane, and it's hyper pure. And it's an unlimited supply of water. If we can pull water from our sewage systems and make it potable and clean, yes, that will be crucial to our own ability to survive the coming decades and centuries, but also for our food supply. Agriculture consumes 70% of fresh water. So we need that. And we are also looking into desalination, increasingly seeing that in California in particular, stripping salt from ocean water.
That sounds a little more appealing to me than the sewage water, but I trust you that it tasted just like Evian.
Yeah, it really does, and it's as one there's a lot of resistance, and in fact, just as 10-15 years ago, I mean, there have been these recycled sewage projects that have been shut down because people are really concerned about I don't want to drink my own sewage, but the fact is that it's actually easier and cheaper to pull impurities out of recycled sewage than it is to pull it out of ocean water, because salt dissolves completely into the water. It's much harder. The more salinity you have, the more expensive and the more energy it takes to push the water through the membranes. So it's about half as expensive to produce toilet to tap water or recycled wastewater. And the truth of the matter is, you're just going to have to get over it, right? That's one of the things that I've learned in my 5 years of meeting farmers and people working on sustainable, resilient food systems. Yeah, we're going to have to get over it. We're going to really have to start realizing that, yes, we can have a diverse, abundant food supply against really scary odds. But we're going to have to, get over our resistance and really start thinking about what are the potential advantages of GMO and CRISPR. What can we do that draws on the wisdom of ancient food, and what technology can come into play? And that might mean, things that freak you out, like eating meat that was grown in a laboratory, not in an animal, or drinking recycled sewage, or eating and accepting that there could be some environmental and human health advantages to GMOs. It's tough because we have such an emotional relationship to food. In my family, food was a proxy for love, right? My mom showed us affection with sauces and flavors, and so it's very hard for us to think about these, kind of this like radical shifts in food production. But it's much more hopeful than it is discouraging.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because you have a TED Talk called "Climate Change is a Problem You Can Taste," and you've sort of just been talking about how we can't really taste the difference between this filtered water and like fresh artesian water. But what are some of the changes we actually might be able to taste?
Well, there's some really kind of, concerning realities that we've seen in recent years. For me, coffee is, my, vice, weakness, great pleasure. I love drinking coffee, and I've met coffee farmers in Guatemala and plenty of equatorial nations who are dealing with incredible pressures of climate change. Coffee rust fungus, which is caused by increasing humidity and heat, affects crops like coffee, and they're very fickle crops, these specialty crops that need very specific conditions in which to thrive. So we're still getting coffee, and there's still ways of producing cacao and quinoa and all these kind of specialty crops that like specific conditions, but it's getting harder and harder. And so, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to continue eating these crops, and because we'll find, ways to adapt the plants themselves and the environments in which they can grow. But, it is true that the delicious foods are most imperiled. Also, though, the easiest crops to grow, corn, for example, is, getting hammered without any warning. Remember the derecho storms of last summer, I believe it was, wiped out millions of acres of corn crops, billions of dollars of damage from, wind that flattened crops in, a few hours, right? So it's the very specialty crops that are under siege, and it's also, the big commodity crops, and all of it is going to require a really creative adaptation.
Yeah, it's something that it sounds a little bit like you're sort of, I don't want to say resigned, but maybe resigned to the fact that climate change is happening. It's already here, and what we need to do is focus on these new innovations and technologies to deal with it. But is there any chance that we still might forestall some of these changes? For me, you mentioned coffee, for example, I was like, yeah, I'll give up meat if that's what it takes to save the planet, but I can't give up coffee.
That's right. I know. I'm with you on that, right? Like it does feel like we as consumers should have to change our behaviors and participate in solutions. And, number one, I should have put as much emphasis on the importance of traditional and even ancient approaches to food production. Like to me, the most exciting thing is what's happening with the resurgence of regenerative agriculture. Agriculture that draws on the wisdom of natural systems, that removes industrial inputs, that finds ways to significantly improve the health of soil and the fertility of soil. It requires a lot more land to produce the same amount of crop on regenerative, farms. So, industrial ag producers are pretty resistant to this. But, there's no doubt that it has huge potential to serve as a climate solution. I mean, agriculture is different than, energy and transportation sectors. They're all three contributing to the climate problem, but agriculture can become a solution in the way that the others can just sort of stop emitting. Agriculture can actually become a carbon sink. The single biggest opportunity for carbon sequestration is soil. The most important medium for carbon sequestration is the Earth's soil. And for every 1% increase in organic matter, an acre of soil can lock away 10 times more, or 10 more tons of carbon. That dark pigment in soil is carbon. right? And generally speaking, the darker and richer and healthier the soil, the more carbon it contains, right? So we can look to farms, and we're hearing about this with these, carbon banks. We can look to farms not just to have less of an impact, but to become a significant part of drawing down CO2 in the atmosphere, locking that into richer, healthier soil, and really, again, going forward, moving into the future using really traditional ideas and truths.
Yeah, I guess as we're, just starting to run out of time here, my last question for you is about that, because I think one of the challenges that always comes up in these conversations is that these smaller, more old-fashioned farms were not scalable. There was more subsistence farming. And the reason that we have the kind of consolidated system that we talked about being a very actually brittle system that's not very resilient is because it was more profitable. So to what extent do economic growth imperatives conflict with what we need to do to make a more resilient food supply chain and a more sustainable one?
Yeah, I think it's really important to say that we're not talking about going from, 20,000 acre or 10,000 acre mega farms down to millions and millions of mom and pop farms, right? I mean, we're talking about robust small and mid-sized farms that can scale to a point. We're talking about replicable models that may not be able to scale, in the way that we're used to talking about scale, but can scale to the point of really sustainable local and regional food supplies, and models that can replicate across different regions. And I think, of course, there are real limits in efficiency to super small operations, and there will be, some of those, we may even see those multiply, but mid-sized operations that can produce sustainable regional food supplies, both outdoors and indoors in vertical cropping facilities, will be essential going forward. And yes, that I think there is a way of growing through replicability and through thinking in more realistic terms about scale.
Mm-hmm. Well, Amanda Little, author of The Fate of Food and Bloomberg opinion columnist, thank you so much for giving us a preview of some of these interesting agricultural innovations today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's great to talk.